be a video to help you that are going to be leading, teaching, facilitating an on-campus small group that's going to meet on Sunday, January the 31st. So if that's you, you've got the right video. Now, you should have received in the email that had the link for this video an attachment that is actually the manuscript of the lesson that you're going to be sharing with your on-campus small group on this Sunday. So go ahead and get that printed out if you haven't done so already, so that you'll have that in front of you as we kind of walk our way through it. And what we're going to attempt to do is just give you a couple of things that maybe can help you as you prepare to lead, teach your group this Sunday. Now we're in this series that we're calling My Identity, where what we're focusing on is discovering who we are according to who God says we are, and then seeing how that works out in our life. And this week the lesson is really going to be focusing about, as we discover who we are, then what does that look like in our lives as we live according to the identity that God has given us. And so we're going to be doing that. That's kind of the focus of what we'll be looking at. Now, a reminder to you, if you're leading a small group that meets at 9 o'clock, then you're going to be covering some things to help that at 10:30 that Brett will be teaching in the message time there that will help them put that together, so to speak, in a way. You're going to kind of introduce really what Brett's going to talk about at 10:30. For those of you who are following the message, you'll be at the 10:30 hour for your small group time. You're going to be expanding on what Brett has already shared about. And both of those will fit together wonderfully for those that are in your class to help us begin to get the big idea of what God is saying to us this Sunday. So go ahead and get the manuscript now in front of you. Maybe grab your Bible, open it up to James chapter 1. Those two verses are verses we're going to be looking at, but it will be helpful, I think, for you, especially to back up and read some of the previous verses as well. In fact, I would suggest going all the way back up to verse 19 and begin to read from verse 19 all the way down through the end of the passage, and 26, 27 ends that chapter. And read that several times just to get a sense of what God is doing and saying there through the pen of James to us today. And remember now, as you read through that, keep in mind that you want to read that passage, you want to hear that passage through the eyes of those that received it in that first century. So we have to always guard about putting our 21st century look on things that were written in the context of the first century. Some of the Bible study tools we've pointed out to you before might be helpful here, where you go back either using a commentary or some other study tools just to get some background of the book of James itself, and also of the people and that James wrote to, kind of their own particular situation and context to help you in that. Now, let's get into the manuscript itself and kind of point out a couple of things here. Of course, page 1 is an overview. It kind of gives us the big idea of what we're going to be talking about in your class time on Sunday. And what we're going to be looking at is how, when we see who we are, how that makes a difference, and who we are, how that makes a difference in how we live and what we do. And that's going to be the whole emphasis of this lesson there. Now, the introduction on page 2 helps us, as always, to kind of get everybody oriented to thinking to the subject that we're going to be looking at from the Bible. And this introduction is pretty pointed, but I think it's very helpful. And talks specifically there about a character that I think, or a famous person that all of us know, who played many different characters in the movies and on television screens, named Robin Williams. And as you work your way through that, you will notice that it points out one of the things that happened with Robin Williams and his death this past year, and unfortunately he chose to take his own life, was he lost his identity as who he saw himself to be. And when he felt like he was losing that identity, it led to him taking some very drastic actions. And I think one of the things as you work your way through that in that introduction, I would say throw this in there with that as you're sharing that with your small group, is ask them, why is that incorrect? What's wrong about that thinking? What is erroneous in the thing? If I can't carry out the identity that I see for myself and live in that way, then I'd see the only other option is not to live at all. And I think that could help you think that through, and also get you ready for what you're going to be talking about there as you dive into the text on page 4. And page 4, we're going to be teaching the text. That gray shaded area on your right, take some time and look at it. It's very important, and I think it will help you as you get ready to prepare. Got some good things to point out in that regard. Now, what we're talking about in this passage is talking about what does it mean, since we are part of God's family and we are referred to as saints. what does that look like? What does a saint look like, and how does a saint live, so to speak? Now, obviously, we need to get rid of that wrong thinking that a saint is some super spiritual person, and maybe something like a monk or Mother Teresa or someone else that we think that we could never be that type of person or can never live that kind of way. And but when the Bible talks about saints, it's not talking so much about that image of certain people that we get in my mind. In fact, what it's talking about is that we are to live life in a different way. And a different way, when we say that, and live life in a different way from those who are not followers of Jesus. So what we're saying here is a saint is a person who is set apart. It's set apart to God and for God. And when we put our faith in Jesus, we become a saint. And so what does that look like, or how does that get worked out in our lives? Now, we understand when I use the word different here, and as our manuscript uses that, understand when we're using the word different here, we're not talking about different in a weird way, that we would be so different from people maybe in some of the outward things there, or cosmetic things that we'd be considered weird, but different instead in our character, and then how that gets worked out into our conduct. And what we're going to be looking at today is not an exhaustive list, but instead it's going to be three things that obviously God says these should be characteristic of those who are my saints, those who are following me. All right. Now at the very end of page 4, there's a very good quote by theologian John Calvin. John Calvin was a theologian of the 16th century during the Reformation period, and is still well read today and looked at today because he has such good insights. And I would encourage you to take a moment and let that quote run through your own mind there. Now turn over to page 5, and we're going to start getting into some of these spiritual markers, as the lesson points out, that are things that, again, it's not an exhaustive list. It didn't say there's obviously more things that ought to be in place in our lives, or more character aspects or attitudes or perspectives, but these three certainly should be part of that. And the first one he uses there is what we see in James 1:26, which we call self-control. James there is talking about the aspect, and he uses an illustration of the tongue. The tongue is used to illustrate this aspect of self-control. And basically it boils down to this: if you can't control what you say, if you don't have self-control over what your words you're using, that's going to speak to the fact that there's something not correct inside of you. In fact, Matthew chapter 12, that Jesus points that out there, and you see that on the bottom of your page 5. And I would make sure to read that verse yourself, those verses, think those through, and I would use those as a discussion or to throw them out to your group to talk about there. But the bottom line is, if we can't control the words we say and how we say them, then self-control is lacking in our lives. Now, that's not the only thing that self-control can be exhibited, a lack of self-control can be exhibited through, but it will become the most obvious. And I think all of us would agree that if we are not controlling what we say and how we say it, speaking to there is a problem with our character. That's why we read over on the next page there, whether he talks about that the uses the image of a bridle, and a bridle obviously was used in both for horses and camels in that day. And the bridle was used to control the animal and direct the animal. And so he's talking about when we become a saint, we become a follower of Jesus, God places within us the ability to control our tongue and give direction to our words, so they're used in a way that are helpful and encouraging instead of hurtful and destructive. The second characteristic that comes out from this passage is concern for others. And you look at James 1:27 and you'll see that. He focused specifically on two groups of people that were basically helpless to provide for themselves, orphans and widows. And in the society at that time, there was no way for them to to get help. They were basically on their own, and obviously they were would find themselves in need of resources just simply to survive the practical things of life. And James says there that if we are a saint, there's going to be within us a desire to help others, to have concern for others. Not just a one-time thing. In fact, the emphasis here is not just where you just kind of fly in, do something, fly out, but instead that there is an interest in these people and an interest in them into helping helping them. Now, the reality is for all of us, there are going to be probably more needs out there than we can take care of individually. There's more needs in Mobile than we can take care of as a single congregation. But the reality is there are those that we can help, and God places them in our path. I heard someone say this some time ago, and it has stuck with me because I think it's so true, and it helps me, instead of being overwhelmed by the different needs and not doing anything for anyone, to realize that God puts some people in my path that I can help and should help. And that same thing for us as a congregation. And here was the statement: do for one what you wish you could do for all. Isn't that good? Do for one what you wish you could do for all. And so that helps us focus on the fact that God has people that come into our lives. He puts people in the way there. And if we're going to truly be a follower, if we're a saint, we're going to be interested in them and let God use us in helping them. In fact, in the passage earlier, he talks about that we're to follow that law of liberty. In James chapter, he says there that we are to the perfect law that gives freedom and continue in it. In verse 25, he says we are to look intently into the perfect law. And what was he talking about? He was talking about the law of love that Jesus gives to us, where Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And when we're a follower of him, that's going to get worked out in our lives. Now, there's a gray shaded portion there on page 7 that I would encourage you to look at. It says, who might, in our day, we may not, the orphans, widows, obviously they definitely have needs, but there may be others too. And who are some of those? Maybe think that through as a group. I just jotted down a couple that came to my mind when I read that. The elderly, many elderly in our own society are on fixed incomes and not able to even meet the basic needs that they have. Those that are sick or ill and who are unable to provide for themselves or their families, the unemployed, people that have lost their jobs, unable to get a job. Not that they can't work, they won't work, they can't work, they can't find work. And those are just a few, and there may be some others there as well. Now, the final characteristic that we see there, or final attitude or final character quality, is there at the bottom of page 7, called personal holiness. And that's where James says there in verse 27, he says, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And when he's talking about the world, he's not talking about the physical world. He's talking about that world system around us, that which seeks to pull us away from God and pull us into the things that are contrary to who God is. And he's talking about our own personal holiness. And holiness is the sense of where we are focused on who God is and we're seeking to follow God. I think we have to be careful here that we don't see that as being an outward characteristic, so to speak, or maybe how the way we dress or certain habits we have or don't have, certain activities we're involved in or not involved in. And sometimes we defined holiness or not being polluted by the world as those things, when in reality, when he's talking about being polluted by the world, he's talking about our end and our hearts, what's going on inside us, what is preoccupying us. And in fact, worldliness, I think, could simply be defined this way. Worldliness is when we become preoccupied by anyone or anything other than God. And it is a heart attitude more so than it is an outward expression. Now, if the heart, obviously the outward expression is going to line up with the heart. So if we're going to not be polluted by the world, if we're going to not be worldly, so to speak, then it's going to start with having our heart right with God. That's why we read Proverbs 4, it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And so what it means is we've got to make sure that we're putting that into our life, we're putting into our heart that which is centered and focused upon God. And that's why it's important that we also do not neglect our own personal relationship with God, both in studying, reading the scriptures, praying, and just spending time with God in that way there. Page 8 at the bottom has a very good quote that's in bold print and kind of sums up everything that you've been talking about there. Would be one of those good things you maybe kind of write on the board at the end of the time if you use the marker board or however you do it. If you put something on a 3x5 card, hand it out and let everybody respond to that, and maybe use that as a little bit of discussion among your group at large there. Page 9 will be your application moment. Page 11 will be the handout that goes along with that, where you have the opportunity to break your group up into small clusters and let them interact around that and talk that through. If your group doesn't fit that, then of course you can use that page 11 at application moment or small group handout, your group at large. It's encouraging to me sometimes when I'm walking down the hallway and I see small group on-campus small groups that are kind of wrapping up towards the end, and I see them actually breaking out. It's clustered up together, kind of huddled up together in 3 to 4 different huddle groups there, and 3 or 4 in each group, and they're talking and interacting over what they've just learned together. And that's where some really significant things can happen. So make sure your group has the opportunity for that. Don't overlook that. It'll be to their benefit and yours as their leader teacher as well. Of course, the conclusion is on page 10 and got this week's memory verse on it. I encourage you to challenge everyone to work on that memory verse, make it a part of their life this week. Have a great time studying God's Word together, and we're looking forward to continue discovering who God says we are and then how that gets worked out in our lives.